Why did you leave your last job? This is one of the trickiest questions people get on job interviews, and it is a tough thing to answer if you don't have the right vocabulary in English. I'm Ryan. This is Learning English Adventures. Let me help you talk about how you left your last job. So, there are some kind of essential things that you need to know in terms of vocabulary. Take a listen to these few sentences and see if you can catch the differences between these. My last job laid me off. I was let go from my last job, or I was fired from my last job. Did you catch the difference between those? Fired is the most negative one. It means you did something wrong. There was a problem with you, and this one doesn't look good for new employers. So you want to kind of avoid saying fired where possible, although at the same time, you still want to be truthful. So if you were fired, you don't really have a choice, but there are ways that you can soften this as well. Laid off and let go, on the other hand, are more neutral. This means that the company was having problems, they were downsizing or getting smaller, and you didn't necessarily do anything wrong, but they had to get rid of you for financial concerns or for other reasons. Maybe they closed a department or something like that. And so if you use laid off or let go as your answer, this sounds a lot better, and prospective employers will consider this in your job interview. Also, when making your answers, you want to keep a good perspective on this one. You want to make sure that the language you use is very neutral, that it's not loaded negatively. So listen to this answer about why I left my last job. I was laid off from my last job. The boss of that job was mismanaging the company. He was losing money. He was creating conflict with his employees. And so they had to close the department. And in the end, I was laid off. That's not really a good job interview answer because there's a lot of negatively loaded vocabulary. I'm talking about my boss in a very negative way. I'm talking about some of the problems with the company. This is something that you very much want to avoid. You want to be very neutral in your answers. So listen to this. This is a better answer. I was laid off from my job. There were some internal issues at my last workplace, which led to the closing of my department, and I and a number of my colleagues were laid off. This is completely neutral, that's not loaded, and it's a much better answer to this question. Now, if you were fired, there are some ways that you can kind of soften this and still make it look good for your prospective employer. You don't want to lie. You don't want to say you were laid off because the employer might call your company and they might check on this. And if you're caught lying, that looks bad. And so you can say something like, I was fired from my last position. I had a lot of personal shortcomings. However, I've learned a lot from the experience and I've been able to adapt to that and change my perspective on a lot of things. Okay, you're addressing the issue. It's still negative. It's still not the best answer. But in a situation where you have to talk about being fired, saying, I had a lot of personal shortcomings, I've changed my perspective, I've learned a lot from the situation, and I've been able to adapt, shows that you recognize that you had problems and you've changed some things internally. So this is a good way to kind of make the best of a bad situation if you were fired from your last position. And there are a lot of ways you can do it, but practice doing this so you don't get surprised by this when it comes to job interviews. Another good way to talk about being let go is that your position was eliminated or the company was downsizing. It just means that departments were closing. You didn't do anything wrong. Maybe the company was having financial troubles and they needed to get smaller or they needed to save money in some ways. This is nothing to do with you. It's about the company. And so it looks good for potential employers, and it's a valid reason why you might have left your last position. Some kind of tricky vocabulary about getting fired is that we had mutual disagreements or we Parted ways. I don't 100% recommend doing this in a job interview, but it is a way to kind of dance around the issue of being fired or kind of avoid the issue of being fired. So if you say we've had mutual problems, means that I was part of the problem, but the employer was also part of the problem. And so I was let go because of that, or I was fired because of that, but you're not using that negative vocabulary of fired. So we've had a mutual separation. Or parted ways is also a good way to do this. That means you separated for one reason or another, and you're simply not telling the prospective employer what the reasons were. That said, they might follow up. What were the reasons that you had to part ways with your last company? And you need to be prepared for that. You need to kind of get yourself ready for those questions. Another potential situation is that your contract was not renewed or that your contract ended. This, again, is a little bit of tricky language. It may or may not indicate that you have done a poor job at your last position. It may simply indicate that the company no longer had a place for you, but it is a way to kind of talk about that your employment wasn't necessarily terminated. You weren't necessarily fired. They just chose not to renew your contract. So it's a good way to talk about how you were let go from the last company. Again, there might be follow-up questions to this, and you need to be prepared for those. Okay, so not likely to come up in a job interview, but retired is a word that means you've come to a particular age and you are no longer working. Sometimes people are forced into early retirement or forcible retirement, which means that they're kind of coming up to that age where they would traditionally be required to retire, but the company might be downsizing or something, and so they might retire a bunch of employees early so that they don't have to get rid of some of the younger or some of the up and coming employees in the company. So you could go into early retirement or be forced into early retirement. Again, unlikely that you will be applying for a new job in this situation, but it's good vocabulary to know. And if you are asked, it is a good way to kind of communicate that you were forced into an early retirement. Now, if you were forced out of a job, if you were laid off, you are often entitled to a severance package. A severance package is a little bit of money or a little bit of benefits that you get to finish off your employment. So if you're forcibly retired or you retire early, you might get a few months severance. You might get 6 months severance. It means 6 months of pay, but they are letting go of that position. Unlikely to be used in job interview scenarios, but if your company is going to let you go or downsize you, then you might be entitled to a severance package, and you should inquire about severance packages as you're going out the door. So there are some kind of tips here for job interviews. You want to make sure you're using very neutral or professional language when you're dealing with job interviews. You don't want to sound negative toward any company, even if they did a really bad thing, even if they let you go with no notice, they cheated you out of a severance package. The language you choose really shows a lot about you as a person. And so if you choose to use neutral language, I was let go from my last company. They were experiencing financial difficulties. I unfortunately never received a severance package, so I am extra motivated to return to work. This is extremely neutral. It sounds really good on your part, and it doesn't show that you're angry in any way because interviewers will consider that when they are considering you for the position. So when you're answering questions like this in an interview setting, you need to think about who did the firing or who was responsible for that. And you need to make sure that you're using the correct language so that you communicate yourself well in job interview scenarios. Here's some additional ways that you can kind of talk about being let go. So I was let go from the role that I had. The role wasn't quite the right fit. You could say maybe something along the lines of I was released from the position. You could talk about there was a performance mismatch between myself and the company. Maybe something along the lines of the company and I had different expectations, or there were changes in the role. It was a difficult fit and we were mismatched. Things like there was a change of leadership and company priorities shifted, or maybe even something like I was asked to step out of the role. These are all good alternative ways that you can talk about being let go. They are all very professional. So they are very good ways to answer that particularly difficult interview question. Why were you let go from your last company? So you should practice these in context so that you can be ready. Think about your last role and start building an answer about why you left your last job. So my last job was teaching at a school that was just getting off the ground, and I actually chose to leave my role in that school because I just didn't think it was a particularly good fit for me, and I didn't really see a way forward with the school. They had hired me for a role I wasn't particularly comfortable with, and I was potentially not the right person for the role. And I recognized this before the start of the term. And so I was able to step out of that role before it impacted the company in any major way. That's kind of a nice answer that you can give when you're asked this question. So practice your answers. And if you'd like a little bit of feedback, feel free to write them in the comments below, and I'll kind of take a look and I'll give you some feedback on your answers and maybe ways to improve these answers in English. So some really good tips for delivering these things, though. Don't blame people. Doesn't matter what the situation is. Don't use that negatively loaded language. Don't blame people. It was my coworker's fault. It was my boss was not very nice. This sounds bad. It doesn't look good for the next interviewer. You don't want to overly explain this. You don't want to go into every single little detail. You want to kind of keep your interview answers at that 1 to 3 minutes. And this applies to this particular question as well. So you can just do a very concise, a very broad overview of the reason that you were let go from the last job. You want to show maturity and personal growth. So show that you've learned something from this role, show that you've improved, and show that your responsibility in the next company is going to benefit from the role you had in this last company. And lastly, you want to kind of always pivot to what you've learned or how you've improved because of your role at the last company. So you always want to end on a positive note. So if you can show what you've learned at that company and how it's benefited you, that's the best way you can answer these questions, or the best way that you can end the answers for these questions. Thank you very much. I'm Ryan, and this is English Learning Adventures. If you like what I do, give me a like and follow. It really helps me and it helps my channel.